Third Reich, the official Nazi designation for the regime in power in Germany from January 1933 to May 1945. The term Third Reich was enthusiastically adopted by Hitler from a 1920s book title. Hitler regarded his government as a logical extension of the two previous German empires. The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which lasted from 962 AD until being abolished by Napoleon in 1806. The Second Reich was founded by Otto von Bismarck in 1871 and survived until 1918. The Führer regarded his Third Reich as the greatest of all German empires, believing that as an institution it would last 1,000 years. Hitler took a fast and unusual track into the German government. He was never elected into power. His rise to dictatorship was through terrorism and propaganda. On August 2, 1934, Hitler declares himself Führer. Since the early 1920s, Hitler had been building up the National Socialist Party, the NSDAP, or Nazis. Nazi is an acronym formed from the first syllable of national and the second syllable of socialist. Names formed by initials or syllables were frequently used in the Third Reich. Imprisoned in 1923 for treason, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, translated as My Struggle, laying down, even at this early stage, his guidelines for the Third Reich. Hitler had planned for war since 1933, secretly building armaments and training men with conscription in 1935. The Führer flouted the 1920s Versailles Treaty. On the 26th of September 1938, Hitler announces his last territorial claim in Europe, the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. 3 days later, Hitler, Mussolini, Britain's Prime Minister Chamberlain, and Daladier, Prime Minister of France, meet in Munich to sign an agreement to stop war in Czechoslovakia. Hitler gets the Sudetenland and the vital defense lines and heavy industry. Czechoslovakia is not present. Hitler is given a bloodless victory. That same year saw the deportation of the first Polish Jews from Hitler's Third Reich. Hitler, in 7 years of power, had recovered the Rhineland, torn up the Treaty of Versailles, annexed Austria, occupied Czechoslovakia, made good friends with Mussolini in Italy and Franco in Spain, and found an ally in distant Japan. At home, he wiped out unemployment and built up Germany's armed strength without equal in the world. On the 23rd of May 1939, Hitler decides war with Poland is inevitable. The Third Reich had become strong with soldiers and armaments, ready to enlarge this Third German Empire. On September 3rd, 1939, World War II began. Few could forget how they had felt that dreadful day.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
After the murder of Poland, the blitzkrieg was switched against the West. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Holland, all are raped. Then it is the turn of the French people to suffer.
January 1945, along the Western Front, American and British forces pushed back the remnants of Wehrmacht troops that had pushed deep into Belgium in what had become known as the Battle of the Bulge. In the east, the Red Army is rolling towards the borders of the Third Reich. Millions of men are poised for the final battle. For Germany, it is Armageddon, and Hitler is prepared to see his people perish in its flames. It had been a long war. The new year had arrived with the hope that it soon would all be over. But bombs were still dropping on London. At first, flying bombs, the V-1s. Later, V-2 rockets, which could be fired from hundreds of miles away to drop their deadly explosives unseen and unheard until they struck. The war had started 5 years previously, and few could forget how they felt that dreadful day in September 1939, and what had happened since. Now, in the winter of 1944, the war finally had been brought home to the Germans. The Battle of the Bulge was the last opportunity Hitler had to stop the British and the American advance. He could no longer muster the forces to initiate battles. The Germans could only react to the Allied thrusts. But Hitler still had resources. His greatest allies were the natural barriers of the Ruhr and Rhine rivers, and before them his heavily fortified West Wall. While tanks and sappers could blow holes through the concrete dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line, the Rhine flowed from Switzerland to the North Sea, and crossing it would require as much manpower, logistical support, and blood as had been expended in Operation Overlord and the Normandy landings. Eisenhower was still Supreme Allied Commander, but there was dissension in the ranks, above and below. Field Marshal Montgomery sought to concentrate Allied troops under his command for a push across the Northern Rhine, where his forces were concentrated. From there, he would maneuver on to the relatively open North German plain, good tank country. From there, he could capture the German ports of Bremen and Hamburg, ahead of the Russians. Prime Minister Churchill, looking beyond the end of the war, did not want the Soviets left in control of Germany. But they were advancing towards Berlin faster than either the British or Americans. General Eisenhower favored attacking across the broad front. Berlin was not an absolute goal. Killing large numbers of German soldiers was. In early February, Eisenhower made his decision. Montgomery would be allowed to proceed in the north, while the Americans would continue the assault along the length of the Rhine. The grand strategy would include the armies crossing the river at various points, and then moving into the industrial heart of Germany in the Ruhr and Saar regions. Eisenhower had nearly 4 million troops at his disposal, while Hitler had just 1 million on the Western Front. While this figure included many hardened veterans, many were mere boys and old men who now made up the Volksgrenadier, the People's Infantry. However, a round fired by a 12-year-old boy could be just as lethal. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would have the honor of leading off this last offensive of the war. The biggest hurdle would be wading through the flooded waters of the Ruhr River Basin. On 8 February, Operation Veritable began with British and Canadian soldiers moving from Holland into northwest Germany. The American 9th Army to Montgomery's south, however, was bogged down in the murky waters of the Ruhr. The Germans had opened sluiceways of the Schwammenau Dam, and and 111 million feet of water poured into the path of the encroaching Americans. It would take days before the floodwaters receded. This left the British in a narrow gap to face determined German defenders of the fatherland. The days dragged on. Finally, the waters began to recede. On February 23rd, the delayed U.S. offensive began. The crucial element was the combat engineer teams. Their assault boats, pontoon bridges, and brute strength were used to get across the river. By nightfall, some 25,000 Americans had crossed. The link-up between the Commonwealth and the U.S. forces finally took place. The way was open for the rush to the Rhine.
After 24 hours of heavy fighting, the Germans submitted. Krefeld, Mönchengladbach and Villeneuve were captured. The air war grew even more intense as virtually every German city and town was subjected to round-the-clock bombing. The American Strategic Strike Aircraft and the RAF's Bomber Command dropped more than 2,500 tons of high explosives daily. On the evening of February the 13th, 773 Lancaster bombers took off. Destination Dresden. Tens of thousands of people died in a single night.
In early February, the big three Allied leaders, Prime Minister Churchill, President Roosevelt, and Marshal Joseph Stalin, had already agreed on how a conquered Germany would be divided. It was clear the Soviets would insist on maintaining strong interests in the lands they were at that very moment capturing in their drive westward. But they were not unaided. The Americans and British had poured vast amounts of material into the Soviet war effort, along difficult and dangerous supply routes. The northern seaward passage to Russia was particularly brutal, as Allied convoys faced attacks from German submarines and long-range aircraft.
Overland Allied supplies had initially come over the Alaskan Highway, cut through the Canadian Northwest wilderness. Later, rail and road links through Persia were finally established. So fueled, the Soviet juggernaut ploughed on towards Prussia. The war had taken its toll on German supplies. There was no oil or coal. Men and armaments were in short supply, yet the Allies winning the war was not guaranteed. There was talk on both sides of a new secret weapon that could still turn the tide for the Germans. Plus the natural barriers of the Rhine and Ruhr to prevent any easy Allied invasion of the Third Reich.
By now, the great cities of Germany lay in the path of the Allied infantry. Over the next weeks, the Germans fought a determined rear guard action as they retreated across the Rhine, destroying bridges as they went. Still, unless the Allies could seize one of the river's spans still standing, the advance into the interior of Germany would be halted too. Up and down the line, the Americans raced to find a structure intact. Field Marshal Montgomery was wary of the haste of the Americans. His strategy called for a coordinated, well-thought-out offensive, not simple expediency. This potential for Allied disunity became clear when the American First Army reached Cologne. The Americans had moved through relatively light German defense to the city's outskirts. After a brief but intense fight at the city's airport, Cologne lay before them. As troops moved into the city's center, snipers and last-ditch defenders fought on. An American Army camera team recorded the final fight for Cologne and its ancient cathedral. On the home front, the message would be clear. The fight for Germany itself would remain savage to the very end. This was the first large metropolitan area captured by the Americans. Its devastation was total. More than 100 million pounds of explosives had been dropped on the city. Little was left standing except the twin towers of the famous cathedral. But the biggest prize eluded the Americans. The Rhine bridges at the city had been destroyed. There was still no way to cross.
Then came the most extraordinary strokes of fortune in military history. On the 7th of March, some 30 miles south of Cologne, at the town of Remagen on the west bank of the River Rhine, there was the Ludendorff railway bridge. In the late days of the war, neither the German High Command nor the Allies expected an easy crossing of the treacherous waters of the Rhine. Nobody had crossed the Rhine in a time of war since Napoleon in 1805. General Eisenhower urged all his units to seize any opportunity to cross the Rhine and shorten the war. German troops were busy blowing up all bridges along the Rhine as their comrades retreated into the Third Reich interior. Orders were given to Captain Willy Brattke to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge at 4 p.m. on the 7th of March. Half an hour earlier, a preliminary charge exploded, blowing a crater in the western flooring of the bridge. As a patrol of Americans approached the railway bridge, German engineers on the far bank set off the main charge of 500 pounds of TNT. It failed to go off. Disconnecting the charge, the US soldiers set off over the bridge at 3:50 p.m. They were led by Sergeant Alexander A. Drabnik, a former butcher from Holland, Ohio, of the 9th Armored Division. The platoon ran down the middle of the bridge through a hail of fire to seize their objective. Not one soldier was hit. By 4 p.m., more than 100 American troops had crossed the bridge.
The Rhine had finally been traversed. News was flashed to Eisenhower, who ordered every available man to converge on Remagen and get across the bridge before it gave way. 5 divisions were dispatched to that one shattered crossing. However, the Germans were not going to allow the Americans to pass easily into the heart of the Third Reich. They poured incessant fire towards the bridgehead. Especially dangerous was the long-range rail-mounted artillery, but the Germans shot whatever guns they could get into range. Even frogmen were pressed into duty to destroy the bridge. A group of 20 were let into the Rhine upstream from the span, but heavy American fire forced them out of the water. They never got close. Still, the damage done by the initial explosions had sealed the fate of the Ludendorff Bridge. It had been fatally damaged. Engineers took huge risks to make frantic repairs to the structure, working in the damaged girders under German fire. The Americans, nevertheless, still poured men and equipment across the structure. Still, if it collapsed before enough reinforcements got across the Rhine, the bridgehead could become a death trap. The engineers began building 2 pontoon bridges near the Ludendorff. This intensified German response. They literally threw everything they had into the battle. V-2 rockets were targeted in the bridgehead area. Their impact shocked the Americans.
The Luftwaffe flew sorties against the bridges, but still the Allies came. The pontoon bridges were completed, and as if to say its job were done, the bridge finally collapsed in a roar, killing 27 soldiers. A further 63 were wounded. Within 2 weeks, the bridgehead was expanded to a depth of 8 miles and a length of 25. In Washington, General George C. Marshall, responsible for the American conduct of the war, spoke of the Remagen Bridge incident as a windfall that had been hoped for, but not expected. Hitler later admitted that the Normandy beachhead and the Ludendorff bridgehead had sealed the fate of the Third Reich. Hitler ordered the execution of the 4 officers considered responsible. Captain Bradke survived, for he had been captured by the Americans.
Hitler and his generals had counted on the Rhine to hold up the Americans, British and Canadians, while he dealt with the Soviets encroaching from the east. Since January, the Red Army had been advancing along a wide front. They continued to close on Berlin. In Stalin's mind, there was no debate about conquering the very seat of Nazism. Berlin remained his target. Budapest was a crucial objective for the Red Army advancing along the Danube River. The Germans meant to hold the city at all costs as a shield against the Soviets moving into Austria. The Danube divided the city in 2. The Russians fought through Pest to take Buda on the opposite bank. 2 Ukrainian armies led the advance. There was much house-to-house fighting as the Germans refused to surrender. Houses were turned into strongpoints, and the Russians were forced to fight house by house. Desperate attempt to supply their isolated forces by air. The Luftwaffe failed. Casualties were high on both sides. On January the 20th, Hungary sought an armistice with Moscow. By mid-February, the remaining German forces surrendered in the city. The Soviets next moved toward Czechoslovakia. The citizens of Prague did not wait for the Allies. They rose up against the Nazi occupation forces, as both US and Soviet forces were headed for the city. After 3 days of fighting, the Russians arrived, forcing the Germans out. The Soviets now moved farther up the Danube toward Austria and took Vienna. The Germans had moved many of their remaining forces to the Eastern Front. Now, with the Americans having breached the Rhine, Hitler's high command saw few options. Hitler would not allow talk of defeat, but its inevitability was clear to his generals. The Americans quickly capitalized on their good fortune. Patton's Third Army swarmed into southern Germany and the Saar, an important industrial base still operational in the Reich. The move put added pressure on the Germans, but it committed men who would otherwise have supported Montgomery's own move across the Rhine. While Patton's forces played havoc with the Germans in the south, it was still Montgomery who was in the best position to move from the west onto Berlin. While the landscape was flatter than the south, the river barriers were formidable. The lower Rhine was wide, and after the Rhine were industrial canals, the Weser and Elbe rivers. Montgomery planned his attack, codenamed Operation Plunder, very carefully. His immediate objective was the small industrial city of Wesel. On the evening of 23 March, a thunderous barrage erupted along a 22-mile front, with more than 5,000 artillery pieces and rockets shelling German positions. Under the cloak of darkness, the first assault waves plied across the Rhine. Vessels from small boats to naval landing craft were used to ferry men across. Once the east bank was secured, engineers set about to bridge the river for the heavy vehicles and many tons of equipment the army would need. The next morning, the continued assault was viewed personally by Prime Minister Churchill, who was determined to be close to the action. The Prime Minister and his entourage watched as the last great airborne assault of the war took place. Some 21,000 men of the 6th British Airborne Division and the 17th American Airborne were dropped by glider behind German lines. The lessons of the debacle of Arnhem were not lost on the tacticians. The objective was just a few miles from the ground forces already across the river, and a link-up would occur that same day. Even though the German defenders could hardly be compared to the mighty Nazi forces that had fought in Normandy, individual German soldiers could still be disciplined and deadly efficient in close combat. The airborne troops suffered high casualties. Nearly 2,000 of their number were either killed or wounded. By the end of March, the Rhine had been crossed along a 200-mile-wide front from the north to the south of Germany. Yet the Wehrmacht could not yet be considered a defeated force. The Allied armies now moved into the Ruhr, the center of Germany's once great industrial engine. The area's factories, from the great Krupp works to the humblest machinist shop, were still capable of grinding out munitions for fueling the death throes of the Nazis. Combined armor, infantry, and air attacks saw the Allies move from town to town in quick succession. The fights were brief, brutal, and always successful. Individual units of the Wehrmacht were still capable of organized resistance, but the sheer weight of the Allied advance overwhelmed the defenders. In a single day, the 35th U.S. Division moved more than 200 miles eastward into Germany. The Ruhr was enveloped, and the Americans now moved towards the Elbe, the last natural barrier before Berlin. They reached it by April 11. Meanwhile, in the north of Germany, Montgomery's forces were facing determined and well-organized German resistance. The Nazis were able to concentrate forces with the sea on one flank. Still, the British and Canadians moved forward. The critical port city of Hamburg fell. Montgomery was heading for Berlin, but capturing the capital was not Eisenhower's priority. Already, the Yalta agreements had placed Berlin in the Soviet zone. Eisenhower sent a cable to Stalin outlining what the Supreme Allied commander believed was the best tactical approach. It included the Americans and British mopping up Nazi resistance in the Ruhr and advancing into southern Germany to prevent that area from becoming a refuge for German resistance once the industrialized north was occupied. Berlin was not a major factor in the message. This outraged the British. Nevertheless, the decision of the Americans stood. Berlin would not be the most important objective on the Western Front. Killing the enemy, according to Eisenhower, not geographical goals, was the objective in war. City after city in the Third Reich now fell to the Allied forces. Still, the German forces fought on. In mid-April, the British liberated a concentration camp at a place called Belsen. And the Americans arrived at Buchenwald. To describe war as hell was accurate, but this was beyond war and beyond hell. At Belsen, 10,000 unburied bodies would be found by the British. Many of the living were merely breathing corpses. Rumors had circulated throughout the war of the concentration camps, but the truth of them defied imagination.
50 years later, even scenes of the camp seem unreal. Yet human beings could and did commit what would later be simply termed crimes against humanity. Human hair was collected for mattresses and insulation in submarines. Gold from denture pulled from the teeth of prisoners. This was the reality of the Holocaust. The Jews of Germany would virtually perish as a race, but others suffered in the camps. Twins were sought for genetic experimentation. They were the Germans who opposed the Nazis, homosexuals who were forced to wear pink, gypsies and the sick and infirm who were considered a burden to the master race. All were slain.
The Allied commanders would only spare small forces to help at the camps. The great majority of their doctors, medics, and support troops had to press ahead with the combat units. Small task forces spread out through the German countryside to provide emergency food and medical supplies. German locals were forced to come to the camps, both to witness the scene of what they had tolerated and to bury the dead. There was little the Allied doctors could do for the many thousands who were dying. They could only slightly ease their final pains. At least they would die, knowing the Nazis had been defeated. For the millions who had died in the camps before the liberation, the Allies could only offer a decent burial. On 20 April, troops of the 7th U.S. Army took Nuremberg, this hallowed shrine of the Nazi Party. The city, like most others in Germany, had been nearly destroyed, but enough of the remnants of the past still stood, another grim reminder of what the Nazis had done to the soul of a nation. time to end the madness was at hand. But President Roosevelt would not see victory. On April 12, he died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Hitler would outlive him, but not for long. In mid-April, Nazi Germany was nearly at an end as an organized state. It had armies in the field, but its heart was mortally wounded. The day after Roosevelt died, Vienna fell to the Red Army. More than 6 million Soviet soldiers were deployed across the Eastern Front. 3 million Allied troops were approaching from the west, and the Americans were just a little more than 50 miles from the city. The Germans could still count on as many as 5 million men on duty, but many were scattered in the Third Reich's still far-flung empire, from the Channel Islands to Greece and Norway. German cities lay in ruins. Industrial output was at a minimum, even with slave labor. On April 16, 11 Soviet armies were poised for the final Battle of Berlin. More than 1 million men. The British had closed on the Elbe in the north, and the Americans were pushing through southern and central Germany. On April 25, the Red Army and the Americans came together on the Elbe. The British and Soviet forces met a few days later, but this would mark the end of the Allied offensive in northern Germany. General Eisenhower had already decided to let the Russians take Berlin. It would be a bloody business. The Germans knew the Russians hated them, and for good reason. Millions of Soviets had died at the hands of the Germans, and revenge would now be theirs. Hitler and his remaining staff planned a street-by-street defense of Berlin. The Hitler Youth were called up. Makeshift Home Guard units were formed, armed with little more than one-shot grenade launchers or rifles with little ammunition. This did not stop the Red Army or even slow it. Stalin, whose regard for human life was tenuous at best, would not hesitate to send as many men as necessary to crush Berlin. By 21 April, Berlin was surrounded by the Red Army. Inside the lines were some 75,000 defenders. The Russians moved neighborhood by neighborhood into the city, then street by street. They fired nearly 2 million artillery shells. Most of Berlin's 340 square miles became a battleground. The city's defensive features were the Spree River and the Teltow and Landwehr canals. At the heart of all of this was Hitler's bunker.
By the 28th of April, they have moved within a mile of Hitler's refuge at the Chancellery. That same day, Benito Mussolini, the deposed fascist leader, is now hunted like a common criminal. He is captured by the partisans and shot. His body, along with those of his mistress and other fascists, are mutilated and hung by the ankles in the main square in Milan. The war in Italy was over.
On 29 April, Adolf Hitler, supreme ruler of Germany and chancellor of the Third Reich, marries his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. On 30 April, they commit suicide. Their bodies are burned amid the rubbish that is now Berlin. German resistance in Italy crumbles under the onslaught of Allied forces after they broke through the mountains onto the plain of the Po River. Italian partisans joined General Alexander's forces in wiping out the remaining pockets of resistance. The Allies are welcome as liberators by the Italian people.
May the 2nd saw the unconditional surrender of the Germans in Italy. Admiral Karl Dönitz continues the Reich government in Flensburg. May the 5th, the Germans surrender in the Netherlands, Denmark and North Germany. On the 7th of May, Admiral Freyberg and General Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims. The ceremony took 6 minutes. On the 9th of May, Field Marshal Keitel and Marshal George K. Zhukov signed the final unconditional surrender documents in Berlin. Eisenhower, Zhukov, Tedder, and Elap de Tesdenis represented the Allied armies.
The war in Europe officially ends at 11:01 p.m. on 8 May.
It was now the turn of the outposts. In Norway, Air Commodore Darville conducted the official ceremony with Koch. General Heine gave up the Channel Islands. It was some time before the U-boats at sea heard of the surrender. 120 of them came in singly over several weeks.
More than 4.5 million Germans had been killed since September 1939. The Soviets, 20 million. Britain, nearly 500,000. Around 300,000 American troops are killed. In total, the war in Europe has killed more than 33 million people. To an extent, the Allied mission up to 8 May was simple. Conquer Germany and her allies. The next day, the West woke up to the end of the war. But there was not yet peace. Germany remained at the heart of Europe. Its millions of survivors could not be ignored. Even if the Allies wanted to bring their armies home immediately, little infrastructure remained. There was little food. Germany may have been defeated, but the Western Allies, except for the United States, were hardly in a position to provide much help. Britain was virtually bankrupt. The Dutch were starving. France and the rest of Northern Europe were just emerging from the trauma of occupation. Still, plans were put into action. On June 5, the Allies signed the declaration of the assumption of supreme authority in Germany. In the eyes of the law, the Allies are now legally responsible for every detail of life in the former Third Reich. Lines of demarcation were drawn. Germany would be divided into Soviet, British, French, and American zones. Berlin, deep in Soviet-controlled territory, would also be divided. Almost from the signing of the document, the Soviets and the 3 Western Allies could not agree. The Potsdam Conference near Berlin in July set the shape of post-war Europe. Stalin demanded nearly £7 billion in reparations from Germany. He also demanded the ceding of German lands in the east to Poland. Churchill and the new American president, Harry Truman, could argue against this, but the Red Army was in fact controlling the east. The Americans and British were also preoccupied with the expected invasion of Japan. Many felt that Germany deserved whatever fate befell her. After all, it was the Germans who had started the war, and the rest of Europe wanted to rebuild shattered lives. The new British Labour government and President Truman left Potsdam with the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe even tighter. Before relations deteriorated completely between the Soviets and the Western Allies, there was one last joint effort undertaken: the trial of the Nazi leadership before the eyes of the world and of Germany. The Soviet Union, Britain, the United States, and France established a tribunal at Nuremberg to try the Nazis. The presiding judge, Britain's Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence, set the tone for the deliberations, declaring, "This trial is unique in the history of jurisprudence and of supreme importance to millions of people all over the globe." Indeed, all eyes were focused on battered Nuremberg when the trial began on November 20, 1945. For the next 10 months, the city in which the Nazi Party held its annual rallies saw leading Nazis held accountable for their crimes against world peace, against the rules of warfare, and of killing 11 million fellow human beings. Not all the top leaders could be tried. Some, like Hitler himself, had already committed suicide. But there were 21 others who would stand in the dock. They included Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and deputy to Hitler. Each of the prosecuting nations had their own staff of lawyers. The Nazis had been very detailed in their recording of their own crimes, and 6 boxcar loads of documents were presented as evidence. The chief American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, was the first to present the case against the Nazis.
In the prisoners' dock, hard-broken men, reproached by the humiliation of those they have led, almost as bitterly as by the desolation of those they have attacked. Their personal capacity for evil is forever past. It is hard now to perceive in these miserable men as captives the power by which, as Nazi leaders, they once dominated much of the world and terrified most of it. We will show them to be living symbols of racial hatreds, of terrorism and violence, and of the arrogance and cruelty of power.
3 defendants were acquitted. 7 were sent to prison. 11 others were sentenced to die. Goering cheated the hangman. He committed suicide just before his execution. Thousands of other Nazis were either imprisoned or hanged. Slowly, Germany began to live again.
Hitler's Third Reich, which he claimed would last 1,000 years, was at an end.